My name is Linda, and at 32, I thought I had figured out what betrayal looked like. I was wrong. Standing in my bedroom with half-packed suitcases scattered around me, I believed the worst thing my husband Gerald could do was cheat on me with another woman. The credit card charges, the late-night phone calls, the lies about working overtime had all pointed to one devastating conclusion. But as I heard those keys turning in our front door at 2:47 that afternoon, I froze. I wasn't ready for another confrontation. Grabbing my purse, I slipped toward the sliding door leading to our backyard, planning to hide until he left again. Then I heard a voice that made my blood run cold. It wasn't Gerald's familiar baritone. It was a woman's voice, high-pitched and unfamiliar, talking to someone on the phone. Before we dive into what happened next, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories that will leave you questioning everything you think you know about the people closest to you. Trust me, you won't believe what I discovered hiding in my own home. Looking back, I realized the signs were always there, hidden beneath what I thought was a perfect marriage. Gerald and I had been together for 8 years, married for 6. We met at a small coffee shop near the dental office where I worked as a hygienist. He was charming, successful, working as an insurance adjuster with dreams of starting his own firm someday. Those early years felt like something out of a romantic movie. Our weekends were spent exploring Napa Valley, tasting wines and talking about our future. We bought our suburban Sacramento home together, spending countless evenings renovating the kitchen and planning the garden we'd plant come spring. Gerald would joke about how many children we'd have, how he'd teach our sons to play baseball in the backyard we were creating together. I felt so secure, so loved, so certain we were building something that would last forever. The first red flag appeared about 6 months ago, though I didn't recognize it then. Gerald started working late more frequently, claiming his boss was pushing for bigger cases and better settlements. He'd come home exhausted, smelling of cologne I didn't recognize, but when I mentioned it, he said the office had switched cleaning products. It seemed reasonable. He'd always been dedicated to his career. Then came the phone calls. Gerald had always been social, taking work calls at home, but these were different. He'd step outside to answer, claiming client confidentiality required privacy. When I teased him about being so secretive, he laughed it off, saying insurance fraud cases were sensitive and he couldn't risk information leaking. Again, it made sense. I trusted him completely. The behavioral changes escalated slowly. Gerald started criticizing things he'd never minded before. My cooking wasn't as creative as it used to be. I'd gained a few pounds and maybe should consider the gym membership he'd bought me for Christmas. My job was stable, but not particularly ambitious. Wasn't I tired of cleaning teeth for the rest of my life? At first, I thought he was stressed about work, maybe going through some kind of midlife career evaluation. But the restaurant receipt changed everything. While organizing our monthly bills, I found a charge from Romano's, an upscale Italian place downtown. The amount was $147, enough for 2 people to have an expensive dinner with wine. When I asked Gerald about it, he claimed he'd taken an important client there for a business dinner. But I remembered that night clearly. He'd texted me saying he was working late, grabbing fast food at his desk. When he came home at 11:30, he wasn't dressed for a fancy restaurant, and he certainly hadn't mentioned any client dinner. The sinking feeling in my stomach grew worse when I started paying closer attention to our credit card statements. Charges at boutique hotels in downtown Sacramento when Gerald claimed to be at the office. A jewelry store purchase for $300, but I never received any jewelry. Multiple expensive dinners at romantic restaurants I'd never been to, always during times when Gerald said he was working overtime or meeting with clients. When I confronted him about these discrepancies, his explanations became increasingly weak. The hotel charges were for meeting rooms rented for client presentations. The jewelry was a surprise for my birthday next month, hidden somewhere I wouldn't find it. The restaurant charges were all legitimate business expenses that would be reimbursed by his company. But his eyes never met mine when he spoke, and his voice carried that defensive edge I'd learned to recognize over the years. The breaking point came 3 days before I started packing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, so I did something I never thought I'd do. I followed him after work. My hands shook as I sat in my Honda Civic in the parking lot of his office building, watching him walk to his car. Instead of heading home, he drove to Miller's Steakhouse, one of the most expensive restaurants in the city. I parked across the street and watched through the large windows as Gerald was seated at a corner table. Within minutes, a woman joined him. She was younger than me, probably mid-20s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a figure that made my insecurities flare immediately. They didn't act like business associates. Their hands intertwined across the table, they leaned in close to whisper to each other, and when they left the restaurant, he kissed her passionately in the parking lot before they got into separate cars. I sat in my car for an hour after they left, crying until my eyes were swollen and my throat was raw. 8 years of my life, 6 years of marriage, countless conversations about our future together, and Gerald was living a completely different life behind my back. The woman he was with wasn't just some fling. The way they moved together, the familiarity of their interactions, suggested this had been going on for a while. That night, when Gerald came home with his usual excuse about working late, I confronted him with what I'd seen. His first response was anger. How dare I follow him? Did I not trust him after all these years? Was I really so paranoid and controlling that I'd resort to spying on him? But when I described the woman, the restaurant, the kiss I'd witnessed, his defensive anger crumbled into sheepish admission. Yes, he'd been seeing someone. No, it hadn't been going on very long. It didn't mean anything serious. He was just going through a difficult time, feeling trapped by our routine, needing some excitement in his life. He loved me, wanted to stay married, and believed we could work through this if I was willing to forgive him and move forward. The betrayal was devastating, but his casual dismissal of my pain made it so much worse. The 3 days that followed our confrontation were the longest of my life. Gerald moved into the guest bedroom, claiming he wanted to give me space to process everything. We barely spoke, moving around our house like polite strangers. I called in sick to work, unable to face my colleagues' cheerful morning conversations when my world had completely collapsed. My sister Janet called from Portland, somehow sensing something was wrong. When I broke down and told her everything, she immediately offered me a place to stay. She had a spare bedroom, connections in the dental field if I wanted to relocate, and most importantly, she was 800 miles away from Gerald and the life that had imploded around me. For the first time in days, I felt like I had a path forward. The decision to leave while Gerald was at work wasn't made lightly. I'd spent sleepless nights weighing my options, trying to imagine a future where we somehow rebuilt our marriage. But every scenario ended the same way. How could I ever trust him again? How could I share a bed with someone who'd been sharing his body with another woman? How could I believe any promise he made when he'd been lying to my face for months? I started packing methodically, beginning with essentials: clothes, toiletries, important documents, my laptop, the few pieces of jewelry that had been gifts from my grandmother. Each item I folded and placed in boxes felt like another step away from the life I thought I was living. My wedding dress still hung in the closet, pristine and white, a mockery of the vows we'd exchanged 6 years ago. I couldn't bear to look at it, let alone decide what to do with it. The photo albums were the hardest part. Page after page of happy memories that now felt tainted by Gerald's betrayal. Our wedding day, where his smile looked so genuine and loving. Vacation photos from our trip to Hawaii, where we talked about renewing our vows for our 10th anniversary. Christmas mornings, birthday celebrations, casual snapshots of weekend barbecues with friends. Had he been thinking about her during any of these moments? Had our entire relationship been a lie, or had something fundamental changed that I'd been too blind to see? Our house felt different as I moved through it, packing pieces of my life. The kitchen, where we cooked Sunday breakfast together, dancing to music from the radio while pancakes sizzled on the stove. The living room, where we'd spent countless evenings planning our future, talking about the children we'd have and the places we'd travel. The garden we'd planted together last spring, now in full bloom, a testament to what we could create when we worked as a team. Everything felt contaminated by his betrayal. How many times had he stood in this kitchen, texting her while I was getting ready for work? How many nights had he sat on our couch, pretending to watch television while planning his next secret meeting? The thought of continuing to live in this space, surrounded by memories that had been built on lies, was unbearable. The weight of starting over at 32 felt overwhelming. I'd have to find a new place to live, possibly in a new city. Our mutual friends would have to choose sides, and I wasn't sure who would choose mine. Gerald was charming, well-liked, successful. I was just the wife who couldn't keep her husband happy. The cruel voice in my head whispered all the criticisms Gerald had been making lately. Maybe I had gained weight. Maybe I was boring. Maybe I'd driven him into another woman's arms by being too comfortable, too secure in what I thought we had. But then I remembered the passionate kiss I'd witnessed in the restaurant parking lot, the way his face had lit up when he saw her, the expensive gifts he'd bought her with our money, and my self-doubt transformed back into anger. I hadn't driven him to cheat. He'd made a choice to betray our marriage, to lie to my face every single day, to risk everything we'd built together for whatever thrill he found with someone else. The practical concerns of divorce loomed large as I continued packing. We'd bought this house together, both our names on the mortgage. Our bank accounts were joint, our credit cards shared. Untangling 8 years of intertwined finances would be complicated and expensive. I'd need a lawyer, would have to take time off work for meetings and court dates, would probably have to sell the house and start over in some tiny apartment. My mother's china was carefully wrapped and packed in a box I labeled Linda's Dishes. The quilt my aunt had made for our wedding went into another box, along with the mystery novels Gerald always teased me for reading. These weren't just possessions. They were pieces of my identity that had existed before Gerald and would continue to exist after him. As I taped the final box, my hands shaking with exhaustion and emotion, I felt a strange mixture of grief and relief. Grief for the marriage I thought I had, the future I thought we were building, the man I thought I'd married. But also relief that I'd finally stopped making excuses for his behavior, stopped accepting his weak explanations, stopped pretending that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. I checked my phone. 2:45. Gerald usually didn't come home until after 6, giving me plenty of time to load my car and leave a note explaining that I was going to stay with Janet while we figured out next steps. I wasn't ready for another confrontation, another round of his defensive anger and my heartbroken accusations. I just wanted to disappear before I lost my resolve. The sound of keys on the front door at exactly 2:47 sent panic shooting through my entire body. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized Gerald was home 3 hours early, and I was nowhere near ready for another confrontation. The boxes scattered around our bedroom told the whole story of my intentions, and I couldn't bear the thought of him trying to talk me out of leaving, or, worse, becoming angry about my decision to pack while he was gone. I grabbed my purse and phone, my mind racing through escape options. The front door was obviously blocked by Gerald's arrival. The bedroom window was too high and faced the street, where neighbors might see me climbing out like some ridiculous movie scene. That left the sliding door in our living room that led to the backyard patio. If I could slip out quietly, I could wait by the garden shed until Gerald went back inside, then return to finish packing and leave. But as I crept toward the living room, a voice stopped me cold. It wasn't Gerald's familiar baritone that I had been married to for 6 years. It was a woman's voice, higher pitched and completely unfamiliar, talking animatedly to someone on the phone. My first thought was that Gerald had brought his girlfriend to our house, to the home we'd built together, and the audacity of it made rage burn in my chest. I pressed myself against the wall between the living room and kitchen, straining to hear the conversation. The woman was saying something about everything working perfectly, and how he had no idea what they'd planned. My heart pounded so loudly I was afraid she'd hear it, but I forced myself to stay still and listen. This didn't sound like the romantic conversation I'd expected from Gerald's affair partner. The sliding door to the patio was just 15 feet away, but I'd have to cross the living room to reach it, potentially putting me in full view of whoever was inside. Instead, I crouched behind our kitchen island, the marble countertop Gerald and I had picked out together during our renovation, and tried to make sense of what I was hearing. The woman mentioned something about after tomorrow everything changes, and the paperwork being ready. She spoke with the confidence of someone who was completely comfortable in our house, someone who knew she wouldn't be interrupted. How long had this been going on? How many times had Gerald brought this woman into our home while I was at work? 15 minutes later, I heard Gerald's actual key in the lock, followed by his surprised voice calling out, "Margaret? What are you doing here, Margaret?" So the other woman had a name, and Gerald's tone suggested this wasn't a planned romantic rendezvous. He sounded genuinely surprised to find her in our house, which made me even more confused about what was happening. "We need to go over the final details," Margaret replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being in charge. "Everything has to be perfect tomorrow, or this whole thing falls apart." Gerald's response was too quiet for me to hear clearly, but his tone suggested concern rather than passion. I realized I was witnessing something far more complex than a simple extramarital affair. The conversation that followed made my blood freeze in my veins. They weren't talking like lovers planning a romantic getaway. They were talking like business partners finalizing some kind of deal, and that deal somehow involved me. Margaret mentioned the life insurance policies and asked Gerald if he was absolutely certain about going through with this. Gerald responded with something about the timeline and whether everything would look natural. My confusion deepened into genuine fear as I began to understand that I'd stumbled onto something far more dangerous than adultery. When Margaret referred to me by name, it wasn't with the jealousy or resentment I'd expected from Gerald's mistress. Instead, she called me the problem we need to solve and discussed making it look completely accidental. The casual tone with which she discussed my apparent demise made my skin crawl and my hands shake uncontrollably. I fumbled with my phone, trying to activate the recording function without making any sound. My fingers felt clumsy and unresponsive, but I managed to start recording just as Margaret began discussing specific details about my life insurance policy. $500,000, with Gerald as the primary beneficiary. Money I'd never thought about because I'd never imagined I'd die young, and certainly never imagined my husband might be planning my death. The conversation continued, with Gerald asking about the mechanical aspects, and Margaret assuring him that, quote, brake failure would be completely undetectable if done properly. They discussed my daily routine with frightening accuracy. Gerald knew exactly what time I left for work, which route I took, where I stopped for coffee. Information I'd shared innocently over breakfast conversations was being used to plan my murder. As I crouched behind our kitchen island, recording every word of their horrifying conversation, Margaret revealed details that made my worst nightmares seem tame by comparison. She wasn't Gerald's mistress. She was his business partner in what they casually referred to as the perfect accident. The expensive dinners I discovered weren't romantic dates but business meetings where they'd planned my death in meticulous detail. Margaret identified herself as an insurance investigator, which explained her confident knowledge of how to make murders look accidental. She bragged about having, quote, with other clients, describing how she'd helped 2 other husbands eliminate their wives for insurance money. Her connections in law enforcement ensured the deaths were ruled accidental, preventing any serious investigation that might uncover the truth. The plan they'd developed for me was terrifyingly specific. Tomorrow morning, Gerald would suggest I take his car to work, claiming his needed servicing. When I insisted on taking my own car, as they'd manipulated me to do by having Gerald complain about his car's reliability all week, I'd be driving a vehicle with tampered brakes. The accident would occur on Highway 50 during my normal commute, at a curve where mechanical failure would seem plausible. Margaret had studied accident reports and knew exactly how to make brake failure look like a manufacturing defect rather than sabotage. She'd arranged for the investigation to be assigned to her, ensuring any evidence of tampering would be overlooked or destroyed. Gerald would be the grieving widower, collecting $500,000 in life insurance while appearing completely innocent of any wrongdoing. But the financial motive went far deeper than I'd imagined. Gerald owed massive gambling debts I'd never known about, debts that threatened not just our financial stability but apparently his physical safety as well. He'd been living a double life of irresponsibility, using our joint credit cards for casino trips and online betting that had spiraled completely out of control. The credit card charges I'd attributed to his affair were actually from his gambling addiction. The hotel charges weren't romantic getaways, but nights spent at casino hotels when he'd lost track of time and money. The expensive dinners weren't dates with another woman, but attempts to impress high-stakes gambling contacts. My husband wasn't just unfaithful, he was financially reckless and now desperate enough to commit murder. Margaret outlined their backup plan with chilling matter-of-factness. If the car accident somehow failed to kill me, they'd stage my suicide instead. Gerald had been collecting my prescription sleeping pills for months, claiming he was helping me reduce my dependency on them. I'd actually been grateful for his concern about my sleep medication, never imagining he was stockpiling enough pills for a fatal overdose. They'd already prepared a suicide note, typed on my laptop to match my writing style, expressing despair over our failing marriage and my inability to cope with Gerald's infidelity. The narrative would be perfect, a depressed wife, devastated by her husband's affair, unable to face the shame of divorce, choosing death over starting over. The life insurance would still pay out, and Gerald would appear to be the devastated survivor of his wife's mental breakdown. The psychological manipulation I'd endured over the past months suddenly made horrible sense. Gerald's criticism of my weight, my job, my ambitions, weren't random cruelty or midlife dissatisfaction. They were deliberate attempts to isolate me and undermine my self-confidence, making the suicide narrative more believable to investigators. Every cruel comment had been calculated to support the story of my supposed mental deterioration. Margaret checked her watch and reminded Gerald that they needed to tamper with my car tonight, between midnight and 2 a.m., when the neighborhood would be asleep. Gerald mentioned that my packing made this the perfect time for the accident. Investigators would assume I'd been distracted by marital problems and packed suitcases when the brake failure occurred, making the timing seem coincidental rather than planned. They discussed Gerald's alibi with the same casual efficiency they'd used to plan my death. He'd be at his weekly poker game at his brother Harvey's house, a routine that provided perfect cover for his whereabouts during the sabotage. Harvey would confirm Gerald had been there all evening, never suspecting his brother was using their game as an alibi for attempted murder. Margaret would handle the technical aspects alone, using her law enforcement connections to access our garage without triggering any security systems. She'd practiced the brake line tampering on other vehicles and was confident she could complete the work in under 30 minutes. The casual professionalism with which she discussed ending my life made me realize I was dealing with someone who viewed murder as just another business transaction. As they finalized their plans, agreeing to meet at midnight to begin the sabotage, I remained frozen behind the kitchen island, my phone recording every damning word. The man I'd shared a bed with for 6 years, who I'd trusted with my heart, my body, my future, had been planning my death for months. Every kiss, every conversation, every moment of intimacy had been a lie designed to keep me unsuspecting until the moment they killed me. The moment Gerald and Margaret left the house, agreeing to return at midnight to tamper with my car, I felt a transformation unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The devastation and betrayal that had consumed me for days crystallized into cold, calculating fury. Instead of running to Janet's house in Portland, instead of calling the police and hoping for the best, I realized I had an opportunity to turn their own plan against them. My hands stopped shaking as survival instinct kicked in. I reviewed the recording I'd captured, ensuring every crucial detail was audible and clear. Margaret's admission of previous murders, Gerald's discussion of my insurance policy, their specific plans for the brake tampering, even their backup suicide scheme. I had enough evidence to destroy them both, but I needed to be strategic about how I used it. Calling the police immediately felt dangerous, given Margaret's law enforcement connections. She boasted about having contacts who could make evidence disappear, and investigations conclude quickly with predetermined results. If I simply handed over my recording to the wrong person, Margaret might find a way to discredit it or make it vanish entirely. I needed a plan that would expose them publicly, where their corruption couldn't be covered up. I called my friend Donna, a reporter for the local news station who'd been looking for a big story to advance her career. When I explained I had recordings of an insurance investigator planning murders with her accomplices, Donna immediately agreed to meet me at a neutral location. I didn't provide details over the phone, but I could hear the excitement in her voice as she realized this could be the story that made her reputation. My next call was to my brother-in-law, Paul, a detective with the state police. I didn't reveal everything immediately, just that I'd discovered something criminal involving my husband and needed advice about how to proceed safely. Paul agreed to meet me the next morning, but I was careful not to mention Margaret's name or her law enforcement connections until I could assess whether Paul might know her. The most important decision I made was not to flee. Gerald and Margaret expected me to either remain oblivious to their plan or, at worst, to run away scared if I somehow discovered their intentions. They weren't prepared for me to fight back strategically. By staying and setting a trap, I could ensure they were caught in the act with irrefutable evidence. I called Gerald, forcing my voice to sound broken and defeated rather than furious and determined. I told him I'd been thinking about our conversation, that maybe I'd been too hasty in deciding to leave, that perhaps we could work through this problem if we both committed to rebuilding our marriage. Gerald's response was enthusiastic relief, exactly what I'd expected from someone who needed me alive long enough to implement his murder plan. I suggested we have dinner together tomorrow night to discuss our future, knowing that Gerald would interpret this as evidence that his plan was proceeding perfectly. He agreed immediately, his voice carrying fake warmth that I now recognized as manipulation rather than genuine affection. I could practically hear him calculating how much money my cooperation would save him in divorce proceedings he'd never intended to go through anyway. That evening, I prepared my house like a crime scene investigator preparing for evidence collection. I set up multiple recording devices in the garage, positioned to capture both audio and video of Gerald and Margaret tampering with my car. I used my phone, my laptop, and a small digital recorder I'd bought years ago for work presentations, ensuring that even if they discovered one device, others would continue recording. I researched brake line tampering online, learning enough about the process to recognize what they planned to do to my car. The brake lines were located under the vehicle, accessible from below, and could be punctured or severed in ways that would cause complete brake failure after a few miles of driving. The failure would appear gradual at first, giving me time to panic before realizing I couldn't stop, making the accident seem more authentic to investigators. The technical research was horrifying, but necessary. I needed to understand their method well enough to document it clearly and explain it to authorities who might not be familiar with this type of sabotage. I also researched Margaret's background, discovering that she'd been involved in several suspicious accident investigations over the past 3 years, cases where spouses had died in mechanical failures that resulted in large insurance payouts. I moved my most valuable possessions to a storage unit across town, not because I planned to flee, but because I wanted to ensure my family would have access to my belongings if Gerald's plan somehow succeeded despite my precautions. I withdrew cash from our joint accounts, not enough to trigger any automatic alerts, but sufficient to cover immediate expenses if I needed to disappear quickly. I contacted Janet in Portland, not to ask for refuge as I'd originally planned, but to ensure someone outside the immediate situation knew the truth. I emailed her copies of my recordings and detailed explanations of what I'd discovered, with instructions to contact authorities immediately if anything happened to me. Janet was horrified but proud of my courage, promising to be ready to act if needed. The hardest part was maintaining the pretense of devastation when Gerald returned home that evening. I had to appear heartbroken and defeated, desperately clinging to our marriage, rather than coldly furious and plotting his destruction. Gerald was solicitous and affectionate, probably relieved that I seemed to be cooperating with his timeline. He even brought me flowers, a gesture that would have been romantic if I hadn't known he was planning to kill me in less than 12 hours. As I lay in bed that night, listening to Gerald's steady breathing beside me, I marveled at my own transformation. 3 days ago, I'd been a heartbroken wife devastated by adultery. Now I was a strategic fighter preparing to expose a murder conspiracy. The woman who'd once doubted herself for suspecting her husband's affair had become someone capable of setting an elaborate trap for would-be killers. At 11:45 p.m., I positioned myself in our neighbor's backyard, crouched behind their garden shed with a clear view of our garage. The recording devices I'd hidden were already activated, and my phone was ready to capture backup footage of whatever happened next. My hands were steady now, my breathing controlled, my mind focused entirely on documenting the evidence that would destroy Gerald and Margaret. Gerald arrived first, as planned, using his key to enter through our front door before opening the garage from inside. He moved efficiently, laying out tools and checking that the street was empty. When Margaret arrived 5 minutes later, driving a nondescript sedan with no license plates visible from my angle, they embraced briefly before getting to work. Their conversation was clearly audible through the recording devices I'd planted, and I watched in horrified fascination as they implemented the plan they'd discussed so casually that afternoon. Margaret crawled under my Honda Civic with a flashlight and tools, while Gerald kept watch and handed her equipment. She worked with the confidence of someone who'd done this before, explaining each step to Gerald in clinical detail. "The brake line puncture needs to be small enough that fluid will leak slowly," Margaret said, her voice muffled by the car above her. "Too big, and the brakes fail immediately, which would be suspicious. Too small, and she might make it to work safely, ruining everything. The sweet spot is about here." I heard a sharp tool piercing metal, followed by the sound of brake fluid dripping onto the garage floor. Gerald asked nervous questions about timing and detection, but Margaret reassured him with the authority of an expert. "She'll have normal braking for the first few miles. then notice the pedal getting softer. By the time she realizes something's wrong, she'll be going 60 on Highway 50 with no way to stop. The curve at Miller's Ridge is perfect because there's no guardrail, just a 40-foot drop into the ravine. They spent 25 minutes completing the sabotage, with Margaret making additional adjustments to ensure the brake failure would occur at exactly the right location. She'd calculated my driving time, the brake fluid loss rate, and the point where mechanical failure would become catastrophic. The precision of their planning was terrifying and impressive in equal measure. As they cleaned up their tools and prepared to leave, Gerald asked about Margaret's investigation plans. She assured him that she'd already arranged to be assigned to my case, that she'd ensure any evidence of tampering was overlooked or destroyed, and that the death would be ruled accidental within 48 hours. Gerald would be free to collect the insurance money within weeks, with no suspicion falling on him. After they left, I waited another hour before retrieving my recording devices and reviewing the footage. Everything was clear and damning. I had video of them tampering with my car, audio of their detailed discussions about the murder plan, and evidence of Margaret's corruption as a law enforcement official. But I still needed to spring the trap carefully to ensure they couldn't escape or destroy evidence. Instead of driving my sabotage car to work the next morning, I called Gerald and told him I was feeling sick and would work from home. Gerald's barely concealed frustration confirmed his guilt and desperation. He suggested I might feel better if I got some fresh air, maybe ran some errands around town. When I agreed to go to the grocery store later that morning, he seemed relieved that his plan was still on track. But instead of driving anywhere, I implemented the final phase of my trap. I called a family meeting at our house, inviting Gerald's brother Harvey, my sister Janet, who had flown in overnight, and Detective Paul from the state police. I told each of them I had something important to share about my marriage, without revealing the true nature of what I'd discovered. When everyone arrived, including Gerald, who looked confused but pleased that I seemed ready to discuss our relationship problems with family, I played the recordings I'd made. The room fell silent as Margaret's voice filled our living room, discussing previous murders and planning mine with casual efficiency. Gerald's face went white, then red, as he realized his plan had been completely exposed. Harvey was the first to speak, his voice shaking with horror and disbelief. "Gerald, please tell me this isn't real. Please tell me you weren't really planning to kill Linda." But the evidence was overwhelming, and Gerald's panicked denials sounded weak and desperate even to him. Detective Paul immediately called for backup, recognizing the seriousness of what he was hearing. As a state police officer, he had authority that superseded any local connections Margaret might have cultivated. He arrested Gerald on the spot for conspiracy to commit murder, while additional units were dispatched to locate and arrest Margaret. I had sent Margaret a fake text from Gerald's phone earlier that morning, asking her to come to our house immediately because, quote, something had gone wrong with the plan. When she walked into our living room and found herself facing a room full of people listening to recordings of her admitting to multiple murders, her professional facade crumbled completely. Margaret tried to claim the recordings were fake or taken out of context, but the physical evidence on my car supported every detail of their plan. She attempted to use her law enforcement connections to influence the investigation, but Detective Paul had already contacted federal authorities who were interested in her involvement in other suspicious deaths. The arrest triggered a media frenzy that exceeded even my expectations. Donna's news story broke nationally within hours, with headlines like "Insurance Investigator and Husband Plot Wife's Murder for Money." The story exposed corruption in the local insurance investigation office and prompted federal reviews of other cases Margaret had handled. The trial that followed became a sensation that dominated local news for months. Gerald received 25 years to life for attempted murder and conspiracy, while Margaret was sentenced to 30 years and faced additional federal charges related to her corruption as a law enforcement official. I testified powerfully about the betrayal and the strength I'd found to fight back, becoming an unlikely symbol of survival and justice. The immediate aftermath of their arrests was a whirlwind of media attention, legal proceedings, and personal adjustment that left me exhausted but victorious. Friends and neighbors who had seen me as paranoid or dramatic about my marriage now realized I'd been fighting for my life. The community rallied around me, offering support and expressing horror at how close I'd come to being murdered by the man I trusted most. Gerald's family was devastated and divided. Harvey, who had unknowingly provided Gerald's alibi for the planned murder, struggled with guilt and disbelief. He'd known Gerald had gambling problems, but never imagined they'd escalate to murder. Gerald's parents initially tried to defend their son, claiming he must have been coerced or mentally unstable, but the overwhelming evidence eventually forced them to confront the truth about what he'd planned. The financial aftermath was complicated, but ultimately liberating. I discovered the full extent of Gerald's gambling debts and deception, learning that our joint accounts had been systematically drained to fund his addiction. Our house went into foreclosure, our credit was destroyed, and I faced the prospect of starting over with nothing. But poverty felt like freedom compared to the alternative Gerald had planned for me. The first few months after the trial were the hardest. I dealt with post-traumatic stress, jumping at unexpected sounds, having nightmares about brake failures and car accidents that never happened. I started therapy and slowly began to rebuild my sense of security in a world where the person closest to me had tried to kill me for money. I left my job as a dental hygienist and enrolled in criminal justice classes, inspired by my experience to help other potential victims recognize and escape dangerous situations. The process of rebuilding my career was challenging but rewarding, giving me purpose beyond my own survival. I became an advocate for domestic violence awareness, speaking at conferences about how abuse can escalate to attempted murder without obvious warning signs. My relationship with my family deepened as they supported my recovery and celebrated my courage. Janet moved to Sacramento to be closer to me during the adjustment period, and we became closer than we'd ever been as adults. Paul, the detective who'd helped arrest Gerald and Margaret, became a mentor as I studied criminal justice, sharing insights about how law enforcement could better protect potential victims. Dating again seemed impossible for a long time. How could I ever trust another person's intentions when the man I'd married had planned my death? But gradually, through therapy and time, I learned to trust my instincts again. I dated occasionally, but focused primarily on rebuilding my life independently, discovering strengths I'd never known I possessed. The deeper lesson of my experience became clear through months of reflection and recovery. The signs of Gerald's deception had been there all along, but I'd been too trusting, too comfortable in my assumptions about our marriage, too willing to accept weak explanations for suspicious behavior. Learning to trust my instincts could have saved me from months of psychological manipulation and the terror of discovering a murder plot. But I also learned that survival isn't just about recognizing danger. It's about having the courage to fight back when fighting back seems impossible. The woman who'd once doubted herself for suspecting her husband's affair had found the strength to set a strategic trap for would-be murderers. I'd discovered I was capable of far more than I'd ever imagined. My story became part of criminal justice training programs, helping investigators recognize insurance fraud murder plots and understand how domestic manipulation can escalate to life-threatening danger. I found purpose in my pain, knowing that sharing my experience might prevent other women from facing what I'd survived. The ongoing challenges of recovery reminded me that healing isn't linear. I still struggled with trust issues and occasional nightmares. Some mutual friends had chosen Gerald's side, or simply couldn't handle the drama of our situation. I learned that surviving attempted murder doesn't just mean staying alive. It means rebuilding every aspect of your life after it's been shattered by ultimate betrayal. But I also learned that the human capacity for resilience is extraordinary. I'd lost my marriage, my home, my financial security, and my faith in the person I trusted most. Yet I'd gained something more valuable, the knowledge that I could survive anything, the strength that comes from fighting back against impossible odds, and the peace of knowing I'd chosen courage over fear when it mattered most. Linda's story became a testament to the reality that we never truly know the people closest to us, but also to the power of trusting our instincts and refusing to be victims when danger reveals itself. Recovery taught me that while we can't control the betrayals we face, we can control how we respond to them. Sometimes the greatest betrayals lead to the most profound personal transformations. I encourage anyone watching to trust their instincts, never ignore red flags no matter how much you love someone, and remember that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about fighting back with everything you have and refusing to let someone else's evil destroy your capacity for hope, trust, and joy. What would you do if you discovered the person you trusted most was planning your death? Have you ever had to choose between running away from danger or standing up to fight? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe for more real-life stories of survival and justice. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they're stronger than they know. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, you're braver than you believe and stronger than you think. Stay safe, trust your instincts, and never let anyone convince you that your life is worth less than their convenience.